Priene was an ancient Greek city of Ionia at the base of an escarpment of Mycale, about 6 kilometers north of the then course of the Meander River, 67 kilometers from ancient Anthea, 15 kilometers from ancient Aenean, and 25 kilometers from ancient Miletus. It was formerly on the sea coast, built overlooking the ocean on steep slopes and terraces extending from sea level to a height of 380 meters above sea level at the top of the escarpment. Today, after several centuries of changes in the landscape, it is an inland site. It is located at a short distance west of the modern village Gulabachi Turun in the Soke district of Aydın province. Turkey. Priene possessed a great deal of famous Hellenistic art and architecture. The city's original position on Mount Mycale has never actually been discovered. However, it is believed that it was a peninsula possessing two harbors. Priene never held a great deal of political importance due to the city's size, as it is believed around 4,000 to 5,000 inhabitants occupied the region. The city was arranged into four districts. Firstly, the political district, which consisted of the Bouleuterian and the Praetorian; the cultural district containing the theatre; the commercial, where the agora was located; and finally the religious district, which contained sanctuaries dedicated to Zeus and Demeter, and most importantly the Temple of Athena. Historical geography. Earliest cities. The city visible on the slopes and escarpment of Mycale was constructed according to plan entirely within the 4th century BCE. It was not the original Priene, which had been a port city situated at the then mouth of the Meander River. This location caused insuperable environmental difficulties for it due to slower gradation of the riverbed and progradation in the direction of the Aegean Sea. Typically, the harbour would silt over and the population find itself living in pest-ridden swamps and marshes. The underlying causes of the problem are that the Meander flows through a slowly subsiding rift valley, creating a drowned coastline, and that human use of the previously forested slopes and valley denudes the countryside and accelerates erosion. The sediments are progressively deposited in the trough at the mouth of the river, which migrates westward and more than compensates for the subsidence. Physical remains of the original Priene have not yet been identified, because it is supposed they must be under many feet of sediment, the top of which is currently valuable agricultural land. Knowledge of the average rate of progradation is the basis for estimating the location of the city, which was moved every few centuries to renew its utility as a port. The Greek city was founded by a colony from the ancient Greek city of Thebes in the vicinity of ancient Aenean at about 1000 BCE. At about 700 BCE, a series of earthquakes provided the opportunity for a move to within 8 kilometers of its 4th century BCE location. At about 500 BCE, the city moved again to a few km away at the port of Norlutos. 4th century BCE city. At about 350 BCE, the Persian Empire satrap Mausolus planned a magnificent new city on the steep slopes of Mycale, where it would be, it was hoped, a permanent deep-water port. Construction had begun when the Macedonians took the region from the Persian Empire, and Alexander the Great personally assumed responsibility for the move. Both he and Mausolus intended to make Priene a model city. He offered to pay for construction of the Temple of Athena to designs of the noted architect Pythios, if it would be dedicated by him, which it was. In 323 BCE, the dedicatory inscription is in the British Museum. The leading citizens were quick to follow suit. Most of the public buildings were constructed at private expense and or inscribed with the names of the donors. The ruins of the city are generally conceded to be the most spectacular surviving example of an entire ancient Greek city intact except for the ravages of time. It has been studied since at least the 18th century and still is. The city was constructed of marble from nearby quarries on Mycale and wood for such items as roofs and floors. The public area is laid out in a grid pattern up the steep slopes, drained by a system of channels. The water distribution and sewer systems survive. Foundations, paved streets, stairways, partial door frames, monuments, walls, terraces can be seen everywhere among toppled columns and blocks. No wood has survived. The city extends upward to the base of an escarpment projecting from Mycala. A narrow path leads to the Acropolis above. Later years, despite the expectations of the population, Priene lasted only a few more centuries as a deep water port. In the 2nd century CE, Pausanias reports that the meander already had silted over the inlet in which Myus stood and that the population had abandoned it for Miletus, while Miletus was apparently still open then. According to recent geoarchaeological research, Priene had already lost the port and open connection to the sea in about the 1st century BCE. Very likely, its merchants had preceded the people of Myus to Miletus. By 300 CE, the entire Bay of Miletus, except for Lake Baffa, was silted in. Today Miletus is many miles from the sea and Priene stands at the edge of a fertile plain, now a checkerboard of privately owned fields. A Greek village remained after the population decline and was joined by a Turkish population after the 12th century CE. In the 13th century CE, Priene was known as Samson in Greek after the biblical hero Samson. In 1204, Sabasasidnos, a local magnate, established himself as the city's ruler, but soon had to recognize the rule of the Empire of Nicaea. The area remained under Byzantine control until the late 13th century. By 1923, whatever Greek population remained was expelled in a population exchange between Greece and Turkey, and shortly after the Turkish population moved to a more favorable location, which they called Gulubachi, Rose Garden, the old Greek settlement partly still in use today with the name Jelabek or Kelebes. The tourist attraction of Priene is accessible from there. Contemporary geography. Territory. In the 4th century BCE, Priene was a deep water port with 2 harbors overlooking the Bay of Miletus and somewhat further east the marshes of the Meander Delta. Between the ocean and steep Mycala, agricultural resources were limited, although Priene's territory probably did include a part of the Meander Valley. Claiming much of Mycala, it had borders on the north with Ephesus and Thebes, a small state on Mycala. Priene was a small city-state of only 6,000 persons living in a constrained space of only 15 hectares. The walled area had an extent of 20 hectares to 37 hectares. The population density of its residential district has been estimated at 166 persons per hectare, living in about 33 homes per hectare arranged in compact city blocks. The entire space within the walls offered not much more space and privacy. The density was 108 persons per hectare. All the public buildings were within walking distance, except that walking must have been an athletic event due to the vertical components of the distances. Society. Priene was a wealthy city, as the plenitude of fine urban homes in marble and the private dedications of public buildings suggests, not to mention the personal attentions of Mausolus and Alexander the Great. 1/3 of them had indoor toilets, a rarity in a society typically featuring public banks of outdoor seats in urban environments, side by side, an arrangement for which the flowing robes of the ancients were suitably functional. Indoor plumbing requires more extensive water supply and sewage systems. Priene's location was appropriate in that regard. They captured springs and streams on Mycala, brought them in by aqueduct to cisterns and piped or channeled from there to houses and fountains. Most Greek cities, such as Athens, required visits to the public fountains, but the upper third of Prienean society had access to indoor water. The source of Ionian wealth was maritime activity. Ionia had a reputation among the other Greeks for being luxurious. against which practices the intellectuals, such as Heraclitus, often railed. Government. Although the stereotyped equation of wealth with aristocracy may have applied early in Priene's history, in the 4th century BC it was a democracy. State authority resided in a body called the Pyro Iota Eta Nu Epsilon Iota Sigma, the Prienean people, who issued all decrees and other public documents in their name. The coins minted at Priene featured the helmeted head of Athena on the obverse and a meander pattern on the reverse. One coin also displaying a dolphin and the legend Pyro Iota Eta for Pyro Iota Eta Nu Epsilon Omega Nu. Of the Prieneans, these symbols express a self-view of the Prieneans as a maritime democracy aligned with Athens but located in Asia. The mechanism of democracy was similar to but simpler than that of the Athenians. An assembly of citizens met periodically to render major decisions placed before them. The day-to-day legislative and executive business was conducted by a boule, or city council, which met in a bouleuterion like a small theatre with a wooden roof. The official head of state was a praetine. He and more specialized magistrates were elected periodically. And yet, as at Athens, not all the population was franchised. For example, the property rights and tax responsibilities of a non-Prienean section of the population living in the countryside, the pediesh, plainsmen, were defined by law. They were perhaps an inheritance from the days when Priene was in the valley. History. Although the exact truth is not known, Priene was said to have been first settled by Ionians under Aegyptus, a son of Belus and grandson of King Codrus, in the 11th century BCE. After successive attacks by Cimmerians, Lydians under Ardys disambiguation needed, and Persians, it survived and prospered under the direction of its sage Bias. During the middle of the 6th century BC, Cyrus captured it in 545 BC, but it was able to send 12 ships to join the Ionic revolt. Priene was a member of the Athenian-dominated Delian League in the 5th century BC and in 387 BC came under Persian dominance again until Alexander the Great's conquest. Disputes with Samos, and the troubles after Alexander's death brought Priene low, and Rome had to save it from the kings of Pergamon and Cappadocia in 155. Orphanus, the rebellious brother of the Cappadocian king, who had deposited a treasure there and recovered it by Roman intervention, restored the Temple of Athena as a thank offering. Under Roman and Byzantine dominion, Priene had a prosperous history. It passed into Muslim hands late in the 13th century. A photograph of the Athena temple ruin can be seen on a popular satellite map at 37.670 degrees north, 27.291 degrees east, about 2 kilometers north of the road from Gulbachi to Atbergazi, in Aydın province, Turkey. Archaeological excavations and current state. The ruins, which lie in successive terraces, were the object of missions sent out by the English Society of Dilettanti in 1765 and 1868, and were thoroughly laid open by Theodor Wiegand for the Berlin Museum. The city, as refounded at a new site in the 4th century, was laid out on a rectangular scheme. The steep area faces south, the Acropolis rising nearly 200 meters behind it. The city was enclosed by a wall 2 meters thick with towers at intervals and 3 principal gates. On the lower slopes of the Acropolis was a sanctuary of Demeter. The town had 6 main streets, about 6 meters wide, running east and west, and 15 streets about 3 meters wide crossing at right angles, all being evenly spaced, and it was thus divided into about 80 insulae. Private houses were apportioned 8 to an insula. The systems of water supply and drainage can easily be discerned. The houses present many analogies with the earliest Pompeian. In the western half of the city, on a high terrace north of the main street and approached by a fine stairway, was the Temple of Athena Polias, a hexastyle peripteral structure in the Ionic order built by Pythios, the architect of the mausoleum of Mausolos at Halikarnassos. one of the seven wonders. Under the basis of the statue of Athena were found in 1870 silver tetradrachms of Orphanus, and some jewelry, probably deposited at the time of the Cappadocian restoration. An ancient Priene synagogue with a carved image of a menorah has also been discovered. Around the Agora, the main square crossed by the main street, is a series of halls. The municipal buildings, Bouleuterion and Priene, lie north of the Agora. Further in the north the upper gymnasium with Roman baths, and the well-preserved Hellenistic theatre, but all, like all the other public structures, more or less in the center of the plan. Temples of Asclepius and the Egyptian gods Isis, Serapis and Anubis have been laid bare. At the lowest point on the south within the walls, was the large stadium, connected with the gymnasium of Hellenistic times. See also Society of Dilettanti, Ionian Antiquities, Volume E. Th. Wiegand and H. Schrader, Priene. On inscriptions see Hille von Getteringen, Inschriften von Priene, with collection of ancient references to the city.